The room was silent except for the trembling voice on the radio. Outside, August sunlight hung over Kyushu like a tired curtain. But inside the small command office, the air felt heavier than the war itself. A single officer, his uniform creased from long nights and impossible decisions, sat motionless as the Emperor announced surrender. The Pacific had swallowed millions of lives, and now it was over. In front of him lay a worn diary. Its pages, crowded with 4 years of battles, calculations, and quiet doubts, carried the weight of a navy's rise and collapse. He opened it slowly, as if turning the last page of a world that no longer existed. What he wrote that afternoon was not strategy, not reflection, not even farewell. It was a conclusion drawn long before this final day, that courage alone could never overcome the scale of American industrial power, and that the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been fighting a war whose outcome had been written in numbers rather than gunfire. The officer was Matome Ugaki, a witness to the turning points of the Pacific War, and a man who understood its ending more clearly than most. But what had he seen in those numbers? And why did he choose to die after knowing the truth? Before the world knew his name, Matome Ugaki was a quiet architect of strategy inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man trained to see war not as chaos, but as a sequence of disciplined calculations. In the fall of 1941, weeks before the Pacific erupted, he opened a diary, nothing ornate, just a practical officer's notebook, and began recording what he believed would be the defining struggle of his lifetime. He wrote about weather, fleet movements, training schedules, but he also wrote about something deeper, a conviction that Japan could seize initiative before the United States awakened its vast strength. What he did not yet know was that this diary would become one of the most honest windows into the coming disaster of the Pacific War. In those early months, Ugaki worked under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the Navy's sharpest strategic mind. Together, they designed operations meant to force the fleet into a decisive confrontation. The logic seemed sound. Surprise, speed, and veteran aviators would compensate for disparities that were acknowledged but rarely spoken aloud. The Battle of Midway was intended to be that moment, the trap that would break American resolve before American resources could be mobilized. But on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the neat geometry of their plan collapsed. 4 Japanese carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were caught exposed, with aircraft refueling on their decks. Dive bombers plunged out of a clear sky, and in minutes, the flagship Akagi, along with Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were transformed into towering columns of smoke. Ugaki, watching the aftermath unfold through reports and signals, understood the scale immediately. The loss of the ships was severe. The loss of irreplaceable pilots was catastrophic. Yet, even as he wrote in his diary that the day was the greatest failure of my life, he insisted the war itself was not lost. Japan still held territory across the Pacific. Battleships like Yamato stood ready, and in the narrow confines of headquarters discussions, officers reassured one another that American shipyards could not replace carriers quickly enough to exploit their victory. It was a comforting belief, an argument rooted in pride rather than analysis. That comfort began to crumble just weeks later. Intelligence officers delivered a new set of reports, dry and statistical, detailing American construction, at Norfolk, Newport News, Puget Sound, San Francisco, and dozens of auxiliary yards. They spoke of escort carriers rolling off slipways in less than a month, of fleet carriers laid down on both coasts simultaneously, of destroyers and submarines appearing at a pace that defied pre-war expectations. The phrase American industrial power had not yet entered wartime rhetoric, but its meaning was becoming unavoidable. Ugaki read the numbers late into the night, running them against Japan's production tables. The ratios did not balance. Even conservative estimates exceeded anything Tokyo had planned for. These were not abstractions. They were the future shape of the Pacific War, a future in which Japan would be forced to win quickly or not win at all. He closed the report, knowing something he did not write in his diary that night: that Midway had not been a temporary setback. It had been the moment when mathematics began to outrun courage. By 1943, the war had shifted into a different rhythm, one that Matome Ugaki understood instinctively, but few in Tokyo wished to confront. The Pacific War was no longer a contest of maneuver. It was becoming a contest of endurance, measured not by tactics but by factories. And it was in this phase, amid the violent clashes of 1944, that the imbalance became undeniable. Ugaki had survived the shoot-down that killed Admiral Yamamoto over Bougainville, a loss that shook the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. When he returned to duty months later, he was assigned to the 1st Battleship Division, raising his flag aboard the giant Yamato, a warship conceived in an era when naval power was expressed in inches of armor and caliber of guns. Yamato's presence was awe-inspiring: 72,000 tons of steel, 18-inch guns that could hurl shells the size of small cars. But even as Ugaki walked her decks, he knew the truth. The age of battleships was over. Air power and the industrial capacity behind it now ruled the Pacific. That reality arrived with devastating clarity in June 1904 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan entered the battle with 9 carriers, including its newest and most advanced, the Taiho. She was heavily armored, built to withstand punishment, and symbolized the last attempt to match American naval aviation. Yet a single torpedo, poorly managed fuel vapors, and a fatal internal explosion erased 3 years of construction in a single afternoon. Shokaku went down the same day, hammered by American submarine torpedoes. Hio and Chitos followed soon after. Meanwhile, the American formation, 15 carriers strong, emerged from the battle untouched. Ugaki wrote that every encounter seemed to bring a larger American fleet than the previous one, as if carriers multiplied between engagements. In a sense, they did. Behind those flat decks was the relentless machinery of American industrial power, producing ships faster than Japan could update its maps. The Essex-class carriers, each a floating airfield capable of hosting 90 aircraft, were the clearest symbol of this shift. Laid down in shipyards from Virginia to California, they took less than 2 years to build, sometimes closer to 1, while Japan struggled to launch even a handful of replacements after Midway. And beyond the fleet carriers came the escort carriers, the workhorses of the Pacific. Dozens of Casablanca-class ships appeared in a blur of steel and rivets, assembled almost like automobiles. For Japan, losing a carrier meant losing a strategic asset permanently. For the United States, it meant pulling the next hull from the production line. Ugaki sensed the walls closing in. Pilot losses were mounting. Aircraft quality was slipping. Maintenance crews lacked parts. Yet the American planes overhead, Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses, seemed to grow in number and capability. This was industrial warfare, and Japan was fighting it with a shrinking toolkit. As he read new intelligence reports, Ugaki realized that courage could win a battle or two, but it could not overcome ratios this extreme. The Imperial Japanese Navy was still fighting on the ocean, but the real battle, the one determining the war's outcome, was being waged in the factories of Detroit, Seattle, and San Diego. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached a scale that even experienced officers struggled to comprehend. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once confident in its elite aviators and powerful surface fleet, now faced an opponent whose strength expanded faster than Japan could replace a single ship. For Matome Ugaki, the sense of inevitability sharpened on the morning of October 24th as he stood aboard the Yamato and watched the sky fill with American aircraft during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The battle was intended as Japan's decisive stroke, an ambitious plan involving multiple task forces converging on American invasion sites in the Philippines. But plans dissolved the moment carriers launched their coordinated strikes. Ugaki witnessed the ordeal of the Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, as wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes descended. 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs tore through the Musashi's armor. Her massive bulk slowed, shuddered, and finally rolled beneath the waves. Watching her vanish was like watching the idea of Japanese naval supremacy sink with her. If a ship built to be undefeated could be erased in an afternoon, then no fortress of steel could stand against American industrial power. The rest of the battle only deepened this realization. Japan lost carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, ships that had taken decades to design, fund, and construct. American losses were painful but replaceable. That distinction defined the new character of the war. Every Japanese loss was permanent. Every American loss was temporary. It was the cold arithmetic of industrial warfare. Months later, that arithmetic turned toward Yamato herself. In April 1945, with Okinawa under assault, Tokyo ordered the enormous battleship to sail on a one-way mission. She had barely enough fuel for the journey south. There would be no escort, no air cover, no hope of survival. Yamato was to beach herself and fight as a stationary gun platform until destroyed. But she never reached Okinawa. American submarines detected her departure, and carrier aircraft, hundreds of them, rose from the horizon. Torpedoes smashed into her hull. Bombs ripped open her decks. An internal explosion split the ship, sending fire and steel high into the sky. In less than 2 hours, over 3,000 men were gone. For Ugaki, who had lived aboard Yamato and knew many of the officers who died that day, this was not just defeat. It was grief. Meanwhile, Japan's cities burned. B-29s leveled industrial districts and reduced entire neighborhoods to ash. Tokyo's firebombing killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night and destroyed the workshops and factories that sustained the war effort. Without production, without steel, without oil, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a fighting force. Then came Hiroshima. Nagasaki. and on August 8, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. For Ugaki, the final entries of his diary grew short, almost hollow. He wrote of dwindling fuel, of empty airfields, of civilians starving. The war was lost, not in a single battle, but in the relentless pressure of American industrial power, a force no bravery could outlast. In the years after the Pacific War, American analysts, economists, naval strategists, and intelligence officers began piecing together the full scope of production that had powered the Allied victory. What they discovered confirmed what men like Matome Ugaki had sensed from their command posts, that the war's outcome had been shaped not only by battles, but by the immense weight of American industrial power. By mid-1943, shipyards and factories were operating at a scale no other nation had ever matched. Entire fleets emerged from coastal cities, as if conjured from steel and steam. Aircraft plants in California, Kansas, and Michigan produced fighters and bombers faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. Ammunition lines ran day and night. Even spare parts, so scarce in Japan, were delivered to American units in such quantity that shortages became almost unthinkable. In effect, the United States had built a second battlefield, a vast industrial front where victory was determined long before ships met at sea. Admiral Yamamoto had predicted this. Having studied at Harvard and traveled across the American continent, he understood the scale of U.S. resources, its oil fields, its factories, its labor force. His warning was simple. Japan could run wild for 6 months, but beyond that, the industrial balance would begin to crush the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was not merely correct, he was precise. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and from that moment onward, Japan never regained the initiative. For American planners reviewing captured documents after the war, the comparison was stark. Japan's yearly steel output was barely a fraction of America's. Japan produced tens of thousands of aircraft. America produced hundreds of thousands. In 1900 alone, shipyards launched more tonnage than Japan produced during the entire war. These were not simply numbers. They were the framework of industrial warfare, a kind of conflict where tactical brilliance could not overcome a collapsing ratio of resources. Ugaki's diary fit into this narrative with unsettling clarity. Entry after entry reflected his growing realization that courage, discipline, and sacrifice could not match an opponent whose strength regenerated faster than Japan could inflict damage. It was a truth both strategic and painfully human. Worldwide, historians drew the same conclusion. The Pacific conflict provided one of the clearest examples in modern history of how industrial capacity, more than any single battle, determines the trajectory of war. And through the voice of Matome Ugaki, we see how that truth is experienced, not from conference rooms, but from the quiet despair of men who must fight on even after they know the outcome. When American forces entered Kyushu after the surrender, they found a diary resting neatly on a desk, its last page dated August 15, 1945. There was no closing paragraph, no farewell. Just the final decision of Matome Ugaki, written hours before he climbed into a dive bomber and disappeared into the vast silence of the Pacific War he had helped fight from beginning to end. That unfinished line became in its own way the closing sentence of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Historians later published the diary under the title Fading Victory, and in its pages, readers found something more than a record of battles. They found a man wrestling with the limits of courage, discipline, and belief. Ugaki never abandoned his duty, but he also never lied to himself. With each passing year of the war, he understood more clearly that American industrial power, the relentless creation of ships, aircraft, and fuel, was shaping a battlefield Japan could no longer navigate. His loyalty kept him fighting. His diary kept him honest. The legacy of his writing is not triumph or tragedy alone, but a reminder. Wars are not decided only by heroes on deck plates or pilots in the sky. They are decided in foundries, shipyards, and assembly lines, in the quiet mathematics of a nation's capacity to endure. And when that capacity becomes unbalanced, as it did in the Pacific War, even the bravest commanders become witnesses to an outcome they cannot change. Ugaki's final act, climbing into an aircraft he knew would not return, captures the human weight of that realization. It was not a gesture of victory or defiance, but of identity, a man choosing to end his story in the only way he believed remained honorable. Whether one agrees with his choice or not, the diary he left behind forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth of industrial warfare. Valor can shape moments, but production shapes history. If this story speaks to you, if you believe these lives, these decisions, and these lessons deserve to be remembered, consider joining us. Okay? CI pessoa. Subscribe to explore more of the untold corners of military history and share your thoughts below. What do you believe is the most enduring lesson from Ugaki's final pages? We read every comment. And as always, thank you for helping keep these stories alive.